It was a crisp autumn morning at Westwood High, a prestigious school known for its elite students and high academic standards. Among them was 16-year-old Daniel Carter, a boy whose roots were far from the polished halls of the school. Unlike his classmates, who arrived in expensive cars and designer clothes, Daniel wore the calloused hands and dusty boots of a farmer's grandson. His mornings began before sunrise, feeding livestock and tending crops before catching the school bus. Daniel was used to being different. The whispers, the judgmental stares, it was nothing new. But he never expected what happened that day. Ms. Thornton, his strict and notoriously condescending history teacher, paced the front of the classroom, her eyes scanning the students like a hawk. When her gaze landed on Daniel, her lips curled slightly. Mr. Carter, she called. Since you seem lost in thought, why don't you enlighten us about the economic impacts of the Industrial Revolution? Daniel hesitated, trying to recall the textbook reading from the night before. But exhaustion from morning chores clouded his thoughts. Well, the factories, they changed the way goods were made, he began, but before he could finish, Ms. Thornton scoffed. Pathetic, she said, shaking her head. Maybe if you spent less time in the dirt and more time in your books, you'd actually have something intelligent to say. The class snickered. Daniel felt his cheeks burn, but he kept his mouth shut. That's it, she declared. I refuse to waste my time on a student who doesn't care about learning. You're dismissed. Leave my class. The room fell silent. Daniel clenched his fists, swallowing the humiliation, then grabbed his bag and walked out. He had never felt so small. Little did Miss Thornton know, her actions that day would set off a chain of events she would soon regret. As Daniel stepped out of the classroom, the door shutting behind him felt like a slap across the face. His heart pounded, not out of anger but from the sting of embarrassment. The hushed murmurs of students in the hallway only made it worse. Some stared, others avoided his gaze entirely. Daniel made his way to the school courtyard, his mind racing. Was I really that useless? He thought. He had worked so hard to balance school and the farm, but it seemed like no one cared. Back in the classroom, Miss Thornton continued teaching as if nothing had happened. But there was an uneasy tension in the air. Some students who had laughed earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even those who normally supported Miss Thornton's strict ways seemed unsure. At lunchtime, the news spread like wildfire. Did you hear? Miss Thornton kicked Daniel Carter out of class. Said he belonged in the fields, not in school. Man, that's harsh. He's a good guy. Yeah, but what can he do? It's Miss Thornton. No one crosses her. But someone did. Unbeknownst to everyone, Daniel's grandfather, Henry Carter, had just received a call. A teacher humiliating his grandson? Expelling him over a single hesitation? That didn't sit right with him. And when Henry Carter took action, he didn't do things quietly. The next morning, as the sun barely began to rise, a black helicopter took off from Carter Farms. Its destination? Westwood High. Ms. Thornton had no idea what was coming. The students of Westwood High were just settling into their morning routine when a strange sound rumbled through the air. It started as a distant hum but quickly grew into a powerful, rhythmic thud. Heads turned toward the sky. A black helicopter, sleek and imposing, descended over the school's football field. The wind from the blades sent loose papers flying, and students shielded their eyes against the force. Teachers stepped out of their classrooms, their expressions shifting from confusion to unease. This wasn't normal. Inside her classroom, Miss Thornton froze mid-sentence. She knew that sound. It wasn't just any helicopter, it belonged to Henry Carter. Henry Carter was a legend. A man who had turned his family farm into one of the biggest agricultural empires in the state. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a business tycoon, a philanthropist, and one of the school's biggest benefactors. And now, he was here. Students rushed to the windows, whispering in excitement, "Whoa! That's Henry Carter's helicopter! What's he doing here? I heard Miss Thornton kicked his grandson out of class yesterday." The murmurs turned into speculation. Miss Thornton's face paled. She wasn't just dealing with an ordinary student anymore. She was dealing with the grandson of one of the most powerful men in the state. The helicopter landed smoothly, and the door opened. Stepping out, tall and commanding in his tailored suit, was Henry Carter. And behind him, walking with new confidence, was Daniel. The school had never been this silent before. Henry adjusted his suit and started walking toward the main entrance. His steps were slow but deliberate. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. As Henry Carter strode toward the school, every student and teacher in sight fell silent. The only sound was the steady clack of his polished boots against the pavement. He wasn't a man who needed to announce his presence. His reputation did that for him. Daniel followed behind him, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. But inside, his heart pounded. He had never seen his grandfather this serious before. Ms. Thornton stood frozen at the entrance, her usual confidence wavering. She had humiliated a student yesterday without a second thought. But now, as she faced the towering presence of Henry Carter, she felt a twinge of unease. "Good morning," she managed to say, forcing a tight-lipped smile. Henry didn't return the greeting. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks and looked her straight in the eye. "I understand there was an issue with my grandson in your class yesterday," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. Miss Thornton swallowed. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, I treat all my students equally." "Is that so?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "Then tell me, is it standard practice at this school to mock and belittle students for their background? To throw them out of class simply because they don't fit your idea of success?" A hush fell over the gathering crowd. Students and teachers alike listened intently, their curiosity piqued. Ms. Thornton hesitated. I was merely ensuring discipline," she said, her voice weaker than before. Henry scoffed. "Discipline?" He pulled a crisp document from his coat pocket and unfolded it. "Because this school receives significant funding from the Carter Foundation, I've taken the liberty of reviewing its policies. Nowhere does it state that teachers have the right to humiliate a child for where he comes from." Miss Thornton's face paled. Daniel watched in stunned silence. His grandfather wasn't just here to defend him, he was here to set things right. "Respect," Henry continued, his voice steady, "isn't given based on wealth or status. It's earned through integrity. And from what I hear, Daniel has shown far more integrity than the one meant to be teaching him." A murmur spread through the students. Miss Thornton opened her mouth to respond but found no words. For the first time, she realized she was on the losing side of this battle. Ms. Thornton's throat tightened as the students whispered among themselves. She had always been the authority in her classroom, the final word on discipline. But now, standing before Henry Carter, she felt like the student being reprimanded. Principal Edwards, a stout man in his late 50s, rushed over, clearly flustered by the unexpected spectacle. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't aware you were visiting today," he said, forcing a smile. Henry turned to him, his gaze sharp. "Neither was I, Principal Edwards. But it seems I had no choice." He gestured toward Daniel. "This boy was expelled yesterday for no reason other than his background. I want to know if that reflects this school's values." The principal's face flushed. "I assure you, we don't discriminate, yet my grandson was treated as if he didn't belong here." Henry's voice was unwavering. "Tell me, Principal Edwards, if Daniel had come from a family of lawyers or doctors, would he have been thrown out so easily?" The students watching held their breath. Miss Thornton shifted uncomfortably. The principal hesitated, struggling for words. I trust my teacher's judgment," he stammered. Henry sighed, folding his arms. "Then perhaps this school isn't worthy of the Carter Foundation's support." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The science labs, the library renovations, the new athletic center, all had been funded by Henry Carter. If he withdrew his support, the school would take a major financial hit. Ms. Thornton paled. She had assumed Daniel was just a farmer's grandson, someone she could push aside. She never imagined he was connected to one of the wealthiest agricultural businessmen in the state. Daniel, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. His voice was steady. "I don't want special treatment," he said, looking directly at Miss Thornton. "I just want to be treated with the same respect as everyone else." Henry nodded in approval. "And that, Principal Edwards, is what every student in this school deserves." Silence fell over the crowd. The weight of Henry Carter's words settled over them, and for the first time, Miss Thornton realized the consequences of her actions. Ms. Thornton swallowed hard, her confidence shaken. She had prided herself on discipline, on maintaining control in her classroom. But now, under the piercing gaze of Henry Carter and the expectant eyes of the students, she felt exposed. "I may have been too harsh," she stammered. "But I was only enforcing the rules." Henry tilted his head slightly. "Rules, Miss Thornton? Or personal biases?" His tone was calm, but the power behind his words was undeniable. The students murmured amongst themselves. They had all seen Miss Thornton's treatment of Daniel, how she singled him out, how she dismissed his intelligence. And now, for the first time, she was being held accountable. Principal Edwards cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take this discussion to my office," he suggested, attempting to regain control of the situation. Henry, however, shook his head. "No. This is something that needs to be addressed here, in front of the students who witnessed it." He turned to Miss Thornton. "Tell me, do you believe my grandson is less capable than his classmates simply because he comes from a farming background?" Miss Thornton hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No, of course not," she said quickly. Henry's expression didn't change. "Then why was he treated as if he didn't belong here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Miss Thornton looked away, suddenly unable to meet Daniel's eyes. Daniel, standing beside his grandfather, took a deep breath. "Miss Thornton, I don't need you to like me," he said, his voice steady. "I don't even need you to apologize. But I do need you to understand that where I come from doesn't make me any less of a student." The weight of his words seemed to sink in. Miss Thornton's shoulders slumped ever so slightly. I understand," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded, satisfied. "Good. Because respect isn't about wealth or status. It's about character." The students exchanged glances, absorbing the moment. Many had never seen someone stand up to Miss Thornton before. And now, thanks to Daniel and his grandfather, they were seeing change unfold before their eyes. Principal Edwards exhaled sharply. "Miss Thornton, I believe we need to review your teaching approach," he said, his tone firmer now. "And as for Daniel, his expulsion is revoked, effective immediately." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Daniel had won, not through wealth, but through dignity. Henry placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Come on, Daniel. You've got a class to get back to." As they turned toward the school doors, the students erupted into applause. Daniel walked back inside, his head held high, not because of his grandfather's influence, but because he had proven that respect was something earned, not given. As Daniel stepped back into the classroom, a hush fell over the students. Every eye was on him. Some looked impressed, others ashamed, and a few, like Sarah and Louise, smiled in quiet support. Miss Thornton stood stiffly at the front, her usual stern demeanor now replaced with something more uncertain. Daniel made his way to his seat, his heart pounding. He had fought to be here, and now, he was going to prove that he belonged, not because of his grandfather's wealth, but because he deserved it. Ms. Thornton cleared her throat. "All right, class, let's resume the lesson." Her voice lacked its usual confidence, and for once, she didn't single Daniel out. Instead, she simply continued teaching, treating him like any other student. During lunch, students flocked around Daniel, bombarding him with questions. "Dude, your grandfather is seriously cool," one boy said. "I can't believe a helicopter landed at our school," another added. Sarah nudged Daniel. "You really stood up for yourself. That was amazing." Daniel smiled, but his mind was still spinning. This morning, he had been expelled. Now, he was being treated like a hero. Across the cafeteria, Miss Thornton sat alone at her usual table. She picked at her food, lost in thought. It was clear that today had shaken her. Meanwhile, Principal Edwards sat in his office, staring at his desk. The weight of what had happened still hung over him. He had almost let a talented student be expelled because of an outdated bias. That couldn't happen again. By the time the final bell rang, Daniel felt lighter. He had come to school that morning thinking he had lost everything. Now, he realized he had gained something even more valuable, respect. As he walked outside, the helicopter was gone, but his grandfather's words stayed with him. Respect isn't about wealth or status. It's about character. Daniel knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, Daniel walked into school with his head held high. The stares hadn't stopped, but now they carried curiosity and, in some cases, admiration. Even students who had never spoken to him before nodded in acknowledgement. As he reached his locker, Louise and Sarah joined him. "You really shook things up, man," Louise said with a grin. Thornton didn't even glare at anyone in first period. "It's like she's scared now," Sarah smirked. "Or maybe she finally learned what respect means." Daniel chuckled but didn't respond. He wasn't interested in revenge. He just wanted to be treated fairly. When history class started, Miss Thornton walked in more subdued than usual. She set her books down and took a deep breath. "Before we begin," she said, glancing briefly at Daniel, "I want to say something." The class sat up, intrigued. "I've been a teacher for many years," she continued, her voice measured. "And sometimes, we assume we know everything. But yesterday reminded me that learning never stops." A murmur rippled through the students. Was this an apology? "I judged someone unfairly," she admitted, looking at Daniel for the first time without condescension. "And that was a mistake." Silence filled the room. Even Daniel was surprised. He had expected her to ignore what happened, not acknowledge it. "I don't expect things to change overnight," she said, "but I do hope we can move forward with mutual respect." Daniel met her gaze and gave a small nod. He wasn't sure if he forgave her completely, but this was a start. As the lesson resumed, something had undeniably shifted. Miss Thornton still held her high standards, but she was fairer now. She no longer dismissed students like Daniel before they had a chance to prove themselves, and for the first time, Daniel felt like he truly belonged. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of ease as he walked through the halls of Westfield High. The weight of humiliation and injustice had been replaced with something else, respect. Though whispers still followed him, they weren't laced with mockery anymore. Some students approached him, asking about his grandfather and the farm. Others simply gave him nods of approval. Even those who had once laughed at him seemed more careful with their words. At lunch, Daniel sat with Louise and Sarah as usual, but this time, a few others joined them. A girl from his math class, a boy from the track team, students who had never given him a second glance before. "Hey, Daniel," one of them said. "I saw your grandfather on the news last night." "I had no idea the Miller name was so big." Daniel shrugged, taking a bite of his sandwich. "It's not really about the name. My grandfather worked hard to build what he has. That's what matters." Sarah grinned. "And now, thanks to you, maybe people will start thinking twice before judging someone by where they come from." Louise smirked. "Miss Thornton sure did. She's practically walking on eggshells now." Daniel sighed. "I don't want her to be scared. I just want her to be fair." As if on cue, Miss Thornton walked into the cafeteria. She glanced in Daniel's direction but didn't look away as she normally would. Instead, she gave a small nod before heading toward the teacher's lounge. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time, Daniel realized that standing up for himself had done more than just earn him respect. It had changed something, maybe not just for him, but for others who had been overlooked too, and that was more valuable than any victory. The days following the incident brought a quiet but significant shift at Westfield High. Miss Thornton, once feared for her sharp tongue and bias, had grown noticeably more careful in her approach. She no longer made offhand remarks about students' backgrounds, and while she still upheld high standards, there was no mistaking the change. She had learned her lesson. Daniel, too, felt different. Walking through the halls no longer felt like trudging through a battlefield. He wasn't just the farmer's grandson anymore, he was Daniel Miller, a student who had proven that respect was not something handed out based on wealth or social standing. It was something earned through character and determination. One afternoon, as he packed up his books after class, Miss Thornton approached him. "Daniel," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I wanted to," she hesitated, then cleared her throat. "I wanted to let you know that I misjudged you. And I was wrong." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded, almost as if she had been holding back those words for days. "You've shown a lot of strength. And I hope you continue to do so." As she walked away, Daniel let out a small breath. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was enough. That evening, as he rode home with his grandfather, James Miller looked over at him and smiled. "Proud of you, kid," he said. Daniel smiled back, looking out at the field stretching into the horizon. He knew this was just the beginning, and no matter where he went from here, he would carry this lesson with him. Respect wasn't given, it was earned. And he had earned it the right way. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of hard work and respect, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Respect is earned. Let's spread this message far and wide. Subscribe now for more incredible stories that will inspire and move you. Turn on notifications so you never miss out.